They took everything the morning after we buried Margaret. Every last thing: the beach house at Murramarang, the investment accounts, the shares portfolio she'd spent 30 years building, $340,000 in liquid assets. Gone before the wake was even finished. What they left me was a rubbish bin bag with some flannel shirts, my old fishing tackle, and an envelope that rattled when I shook it. Inside was a key, small, scratched brass, tied to a piece of faded blue ribbon, the kind of key that opens nothing important, the kind of key a man holds in his palm and feels the full weight of 68 years pressing down on him all at once. My name is Raymond Calloway. I was a roof tiler for 40 years. I've stood on the ridgelines of half the homes in the Illawarra region, inspecting every join, every flashing, every point where the outside world tries to force its way in. I know what a structure looks like when it's sound, and I know what it looks like when the rot has already taken hold underneath a surface that still looks perfectly fine from the street. I thought I knew the difference. I was wrong about the most important structure in my life for 37 years, but I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand where this started before you can understand where it ended. I met Margaret Holden in 1986 at a hardware expo in Wollongong. She was there representing her father's building supply company, Holden and Associates. And I was there because someone had to go, and it wasn't going to be my boss. She was 41, I was 31, and she laughed at something I said about the wrong grade of roofing screws with a genuineness that stopped me mid-sentence. We were married 14 months later. Her 3 children from her first marriage: Cassandra, who was 19, Philip, who was 16, and the youngest, Darren, who was 12, stood at the front of the church in their formal clothes, with expressions that told me everything I needed to know, if only I'd been paying attention. I told myself it was nerves. I told myself it was grief. Still, for their father, Jeffrey, who had passed 3 years earlier, I told myself that time and patience and consistency would close the gap between us. I told myself a lot of things over the next 37 years, and the sum total of all that telling was that I became very good at making excuses for people who had already decided they didn't want to make room for me. Cassandra was the one who ran things after Jeffrey died. Even at 19, she had her mother's sharp intelligence and her grandfather's taste for leverage. She was the one who first started calling me Ray instead of Dad, which was fine, and then started calling me Mum's husband in front of her siblings, which was not. Philip followed her lead in everything. Darren was the youngest and the kindest. But kindness without a spine is just whether it changes based on whoever is standing closest. By the time Cassandra was 30, she was running Holden and Associates. By the time she was 40, she had restructured it twice in ways that quietly moved Margaret further from the decision-making and closer to a figurehead role. Margaret told me it was better for the company. I believed her because I needed to. There were small moments over the years that I filed away under the wrong headings. The Christmas in 2003, when Philip handed out envelopes with gift cards, and mine wasn't among them. And Margaret said nothing. The family photograph taken at Cassandra's 50th, where I was positioned at the edge, and then, in the framed version that went up in her hallway, cropped out entirely. The time I overheard Darren on the phone to someone, his voice low, saying he's not actually family, is he? So why does it matter what he thinks? I brought these things to Margaret one at a time. And one at a time she smoothed them over with explanations that made just enough sense that I accepted them. She was good at that. Brilliant, actually. I just didn't understand yet what she was being brilliant about. Margaret died on a Thursday in April, 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in October and gone by April, 6 months. She was 72. I was 66. And I sat beside her bed every night for those 6 months and held her hand and talked to her about nothing important. The garden, the news, A funny thing I'd seen at the shops, because I could see that she was trying to tell me something and couldn't. And I didn't want her to spend her last energy on guilt. That was my mistake. I should have listened harder. The reading of the will happened 8 days after the funeral at Cassandra's solicitor's office in Sydney. I drove up alone. The three of them arrived together in Cassandra's car, dressed like they were going to a board meeting, which, in a sense, they were. The solicitor, a thin man named Gordon Ellsworth, read through the document with the measured pace of someone who has delivered bad news enough times to understand that slowing down doesn't actually soften it. Margaret's estate, the Murramarang property, the investment accounts, the company shares, a managed super fund worth just over $1.4 million, was distributed between Cassandra, Philip, and Darren in equal thirds. My status in the document was described in formal legal language as de facto partner of limited domestic contribution. There was a note attached clarifying that I had been provided with accommodation and household support throughout the relationship, constituting adequate compensation for services rendered. Services rendered, 37 years. Services rendered. Cassandra didn't even try to hide the satisfaction. She thanked Gordon, stood up, and said to me without looking at me that the Murramarang house would be listed by the end of the month, and I should make arrangements accordingly. Philip nodded along like a bobblehead in a suit. Darren looked at the floor. Gordon slid an envelope across the table and said it was noted in the will as a personal item for my retention. I drove back to Murramarang in a fog so thick I pulled over twice on the Prince's Highway because I didn't trust my own reflexes. I sat in the car outside the house I had re-roofed myself in 2009, the house where I had built the back deck and installed the water tank and spent 31 summers, and I opened the envelope, the key, and underneath it, on a small rectangle of Margaret's personal note card, in her handwriting, Raymond, Murramarang, the old Calloway place. You'll know the gate. Go alone. Trust me one more time. I sat with that card for a long time. Murramarang was a stretch of coastal bush south of Bateman's Bay, about 2 hours north of where I was sitting. Margaret had mentioned it once or twice over the years as a place she'd visited as a child. I'd never been. I had never thought to ask why she went back there sometimes, 2 or 3 times a year, always alone, always for a long weekend, always returning quieter and more watchful than when she left. I thought it was her way of managing stress. I thought it was space she needed for herself, which I respected, because I'd always believed that a healthy marriage included room for each person to breathe independently. I had been so committed to respecting her privacy that I had never once considered that privacy might be a structure she was building for a specific reason. I drove to Murramarang the next morning. The Calloway property was down a fire trail off a gravel road that I nearly missed twice. The gate was iron, old, orange with rust along the bottom rail. The key fit the padlock with a solidity that surprised me smooth. No resistance, like it had been used recently. The gate swung open onto a dirt track through spotted gum and banksia, and I followed it for about 400 meters until the trees opened up and I saw it. A timber cottage, Federation style, maybe 100 years old. Corrugated iron roof, and I noticed immediately, because it's what I do, that the roof was in excellent condition. Recent work, not the original iron. Someone had been maintaining this properly. The veranda boards were tight, the stumps were solid, the gutters were clear. This wasn't a ruin. Someone had been caring for this place consistently and recently. A woman was sitting on the veranda steps waiting for me. She was perhaps 75, with white hair pulled back and the sun-weathered face of someone who spends most of their time outdoors. She stood up when I got out of the car and said, "You're Raymond. I've been expecting you for about 37 years." Her name was Judith Rayner. She'd been Margaret's closest friend since they were 17. And she had been the caretaker of this property for the past 2 decades. She told me the property had been in my name since 1991. I had to sit down on the veranda steps to hear the rest of it. Inside the cottage, on the kitchen table, was a cardboard archive box. Inside that box were 28 manila folders, one for each year from 1988 to 2016, and after 2016 a series of sealed envelopes, one for each subsequent year. And on top of the box, in an envelope marked "Read this first," was a letter in Margaret's handwriting, 12 pages long, that rearranged every assumption I had ever made about my marriage. She began by apologizing not for what she had done, but for how long it had taken her to tell me. She wrote that she had come close to telling me the truth at least a dozen times and had stopped herself each time because she believed, and the evidence had always confirmed that knowing would put me in a worse position than not knowing. She asked me to trust that belief one more time while I read. Margaret had first understood the danger in the spring of 1988. I had recently been offered a partnership in a small roofing company by a colleague, which would have meant taking on a business loan in my own name and moving some of our shared finances to support the initial investment. We discussed it. I was excited. Margaret was supportive, or so I thought. What I didn't know was that 3 days after that conversation, Cassandra, 21 years old, already moving in her grandfather's circles, had gone to Margaret's father, a man named Stuart Holden, with a very clear message. If Margaret allowed me to become a financial partner in the Holden family's affairs in any meaningful way, Stuart would restructure the company trust in a way that would cut Margaret out of her inheritance entirely. The old man had never approved of me. Working class, no family money, no university degree, 10 years younger than his daughter. He had tolerated the marriage, but he had no intention of tolerating my integration into the financial architecture of what he'd built. Margaret withdrew her support for the partnership. She told me the timing wasn't right. I was disappointed, but I accepted it. That was the first move in a long game I didn't know was being played. The 1988 folder contained a letter Margaret had written to herself that week. Not to me, to herself, working through what she had just understood, that her children had aligned with her father, that the alignment was about money and inheritance, and that the most direct way to protect me was to make sure I never looked like a threat. She wrote, "If they believe Raymond has nothing to gain, they will leave Raymond alone. If they believe I value him as a partner, they will find a way to remove him." That logic had governed 37 years of her behavior toward me, and I, trusting and patient and committed to respecting her need for space, had made it very easy for her to maintain. The letters from the early years were careful and controlled. But by the mid-90s, the tone shifted. Cassandra had taken over day-to-day management of Holden and Associates and had begun finding ways to isolate Margaret from her own finances. The 1996 folder contained documentation of an attempt by Cassandra and Philip to have a power of attorney established over Margaret's personal accounts, citing concern for her mental health. Margaret had quietly had herself assessed by 3 separate psychiatrists, all of whom confirmed she was entirely competent, and she had lodged those assessments with a separate solicitor in Canberra, not Sydney, far from Cassandra's network. She never told me any of this. I was living in the same house, sleeping in the same bed, eating dinner across from her every night, and she was quietly fighting a legal battle to retain control of her own affairs. She didn't tell me because if I had known, I would have confronted Cassandra directly, and Cassandra would have responded by accelerating the process. Margaret's judgment was that my visible ignorance was my best protection. By 2001, the threat had escalated. There was a folder containing a printed email chain that made my stomach drop. Philip, writing to Cassandra, discussing a plan to contest our marriage itself, to argue, through a friendly legal contact, that the marriage had been obtained through undue influence on Margaret's part. They wanted a legal mechanism to classify me as having no legitimate claim to anything associated with Margaret. Cassandra had replied that it was worth exploring, but only as a last resort. They would first try to manage the financial structure so that nothing meaningful ever reached me, regardless of the marriage's legal status. That plan became the will, the servant language de facto partner of limited domestic contribution. Adequate compensation for services rendered was not a late addition. It was drafted in 2004. The same year Margaret was diagnosed with her first minor health scare, and it was the language Cassandra's solicitor had proposed as the cleanest legal mechanism to ensure I had no grounds for a family provision claim. Margaret had signed it because the alternative was Cassandra following through on a threat to initiate an elder abuse investigation against her. A fabricated investigation, based on nothing but one that would have consumed her final years in legal proceedings. She signed the will, and she used the 5 years that followed to build what I was now sitting inside. The Murramarang property had been purchased in her name in 1989 and transferred to mine in 1991, before the Holden Company Trust had been restructured to restrict her personal asset movements. It predated every legal mechanism Cassandra had subsequently built. It was mine, cleanly and completely, and there was nothing in Margaret's estate that could touch it because it had never been part of her estate. Judith brought me tea while I read. Strong, no sugar, which is how I take it, and I didn't ask how she knew. She sat across the table and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. The folders from 2001 onward documented a different kind of threat. In November of that year, I was driving back from a job in Nowra when a tire blew out on the Prince's Highway at 80 kilometers an hour. I went into the gravel shoulder, overcorrected, and put the ute into a fence. I walked away with a cracked collarbone and a story I told at barbecues for years about how I'd always had good reflexes. I had never questioned the tire. Why would I? The 2001 folder contained a receipt from a tire service in Wollongong for a repair to a tire on my specific vehicle registration. The receipt was in Philip's name. Below it was a report from a tire safety assessor that Margaret had commissioned afterward, obtained through Judith to ensure no connection to the family. The assessor's finding was that the tire had been compromised at the valve stem, weakened in a way that would fail under sustained highway speed, but would show no visible damage in a casual inspection. Philip had been 28 years old. He had stood at the hospital and patted my uninjured shoulder and said, "You're tough as old boots, Ray." I had thought he was warming to me. I had to put the folder down and walk outside for a while. There was a creek at the bottom of the property, running over flat gray rocks toward the coast. And I stood there for 20 minutes, listening to it before I could go back in. The 2005 folder was thicker. That was the year I had a serious episode of high blood pressure, dizzy spells, headaches behind my eyes, a reading at the GP that got me referred to a cardiologist. It lasted almost 18 months. My GP had adjusted my medication twice because the first prescription didn't seem to be working properly. I'd assumed I was just one of those patients who needed calibrating. What I found in the folder was documentation of Darren, who by then was 31 and working in pharmaceutical logistics. Darren, the kind one. The one who looked at the floor during the will reading. Margaret had discovered, through a contact she'd developed at the medical center, that her youngest son had been visiting the house during the 2 days a week I worked early starts, and she was at her book group. On 3 occasions, photographed by a neighbor's security camera that Margaret had accessed through Judith, he had let himself in with a key he shouldn't have had. The medication in my weekly organizer had been interfered with. Not replaced entirely, that would have been too obvious. Diluted, Margaret wrote. The active compounds reduced through substitution, so that my blood pressure appeared unresponsive to treatment. A slow, deniable, patient escalation. The GP would eventually conclude I needed stronger intervention. What form that intervention might take, Margaret couldn't say for certain, but she had found a notation in Darren's personal email, accessed through means she didn't explain in the letter, that referenced the aged care option as something worth discussing once Ray's health profile makes it viable. Margaret had driven to Canberra herself and procured my medication from a different pharmacy under a different GP's referral, switching my supply without my knowledge. She had left the compromised pills in the organizer so that Darren would see no change and stop. She had sat across from me at dinner every night for 18 months, watching me take medication she had secretly replaced, watching my blood pressure stabilize, watching her son believe his plan was still in motion, and she had said nothing to me because telling me meant telling me that my gentle, floor-staring stepson had been slowly dismantling my health for a property claim. She had saved my life with a prescription and a drive to Canberra, and had never said a word about it. I thought about every dinner in 2005 and 2006. I thought about how she used to pour my water before I asked, how she had insisted on making my lunches that year, which I'd thought was affectionate, how she'd asked me to change GP practices in 2007, and I'd been mildly annoyed because I liked my old GP, and I'd done it anyway to avoid a disagreement. How many things I had read as mild eccentricity or occasional warmth that were, in fact, a woman standing between me and her own children, with nothing but quiet intelligence and the willingness to carry the whole weight alone. It took me 3 days to read all 28 folders. Judith fed me and didn't crowd me. On the second evening, she made a lamb stew, and we sat on the veranda, and she told me about the years she had watched Margaret drive down that fire trail, carrying another folder. Another year's worth of documentation. Another year of a performance that was costing her more than I would ever fully understand. She always said the same thing when she arrived, Judith told me. She'd put the folder in the box and she'd say, "1 more year and he's still standing," like she was marking it off a tally. On the third day, I found the final envelope at the bottom of the archive box. It was sealed with wax, cream-colored, and had my name on it in the same careful hand as the note card. I opened it at the kitchen table with my tea going cold beside me. She had written it in the last month of her life, in hospital, with handwriting that was less steady than the rest, but still precise in its intent. She told me she was sorry for the silence. She said that carrying the truth alone for 37 years had been the only thing she could think of that would keep me whole, but that she understood, if whole wasn't the right word, for a man who had spent 37 years believing his wife found him easier to keep at a distance. She said the distance had been a door, not a wall. She had locked it from her side to stop them from coming through. She told me that the cottage, the land, and a trust account managed through Judith's firm that had been accruing since 1993 were mine without condition. The trust held $412,000 in today's value, accumulated from her personal income across 29 years of quiet, consistent transfers in amounts too small to trigger Cassandra's attention. She had been building my floor while they were building my ceiling. She had also, in the final year of her life, filed a series of statutory declarations with a notary in Bateman's Bay detailed, witnessed, admissible describing the actions of all 3 of her children against me. The tyre, the medication, an attempted forgery of my signature on a document in 2012 that I had never seen, designed to establish that I had agreed to relinquish any future property claim. The threats made to her in 2004 when she was ill, all of it. Documented, witnessed, sitting in a sealed file with a solicitor who had instructions to release it to the relevant authorities if Margaret's death was followed by any legal action against me or any challenge to the transfer of the Murramarang property. She had built a wall around my future with 37 years of paperwork and silence, and she had only ever asked me to trust her once, in the last thing she ever wrote to me. I sat with that letter until the light went flat over the spotted gums and the creak noise rose in the dark. Then I drove back to Murrambula, packed what was mine, and left the key on the kitchen bench. I moved into the Murramarang cottage 2 weeks later. Judith helped me understand the property and the trust, and introduced me to the local solicitor who held Margaret's statutory declarations. I spent the first month doing what I have always done when I don't know what else to do. I inspected the roof, repaired 2 sections of fascia along the eastern elevation, repointed the chimney stack, and cleared the gutters. The work was clean and the structure was sound, and it was the most at peace I had felt in years. Cassandra called me 3 times in that first month. The calls were about the Murramarang house sale and my removal from the mailing list for family communications, both of which were, she explained, purely administrative. Her tone was the tone of someone who believes they have won something. I let the calls go to voicemail. I had nothing useful to say to her yet. What changed things was Darren. He came alone, about 6 weeks after the funeral, without telling the others. He drove down from Sydney and parked at the gate and knocked instead of letting himself in, which told me something about the state he was in. He was 50 now, softer than he'd been in his corporate years, and he stood on my veranda with his hands in his pockets, looking like a man who has rehearsed something so many times he's no longer sure he believes it. He started with the version he'd prepared. He said the will was Cassandra's doing, that he'd tried to argue against it, that the family had been in a difficult position with the estate, and he hoped I could understand the complexity of it. I let him finish. Then I went inside and came back with the folder from 2005 and set it on the veranda rail between us. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. "How much of it did she document?" he asked. "All of it," I said. "Every year. 28 folders." He sat down on the veranda step. He didn't say anything for several minutes. When he finally spoke, he didn't try another version. He said he had been 23 when Cassandra first brought him into the plan, and that it had started as something he hadn't fully understood and had become something he was too far into to see a way out of, and that he knew that explanation didn't constitute a reason, only a sequence of facts. He said the thing with the medication had been the worst of it, that he had told himself a story about it at the time that he had since stopped being able to tell. I asked him one question. I asked him whether, in November 2001, he had known what Philip did to my tyre. He looked at the floor of the veranda, which is what he always did when a true answer was going to cost him something. Then he looked at me and said yes. I stood up and told him that I needed him to leave, that I wasn't finished deciding what to do with what Margaret had left me, including the statutory declarations, and that I would be in contact with him when I had decided. He nodded and walked back to his car and drove out through the gate without another word. I called Margaret's solicitor in Bateman's Bay the next morning and had a long conversation about options. What followed over the next several months was not revenge. I want to be precise about that because the distinction matters to me. Revenge is about returning pain. And I am 68 years old and I have no interest in spending whatever years I have left as a vehicle for delivering pain to anyone. What I wanted was accountability, which is a different thing entirely. Accountability means the truth is acknowledged, the consequences are proportionate, and something constructive comes after. Philip was the one who faced the most direct consequences. The statutory declaration regarding the tyre was referred to the police, and the matter was pursued. He was 61 years old, no prior record, and the outcome was not a prison sentence, but a conviction and a fine and the kind of public record that follows a person. More significantly, the referral triggered a mandatory review of his professional conduct in the financial sector. His advisory license was suspended pending investigation. Last I heard, he was working in his wife's shop in Katoomba. Cassandra's legal maneuvers regarding the will were examined by the public trustee following a complaint lodged by Margaret's Bateman's Bay solicitor on the basis of the documented threats made during Margaret's illness. The estate was not reversed. That was never a realistic outcome. But a family provision order was successfully applied for on my behalf, resulting in a settlement from the estate that was not insubstantial. Cassandra signed the settlement without contest, which told me that the statutory declarations had been specific enough that contesting was not a risk she was willing to take. Darren I handled differently. He had come to my door without being asked. He had told the truth when I gave him the chance not to. He had said yes when yes was the hardest word in his vocabulary, and the easiest lie was sitting right there. Margaret's letter had told me something about Darren that I've turned over many times since. She wrote that she believed her youngest had a conscience that had been trained out of him, and that she was not certain whether it had survived, but that, if it had, it would show itself when he had nothing left to gain from hiding it. He and I have had 4 conversations since that afternoon on the veranda. They have been careful and sometimes difficult, and occasionally something closer to honest than I expected. I am not going to tell you that Darren and I are family now, because that word has a weight I'm not sure either of us can hold yet. But I will tell you that last spring, he came down on his own time and spent a weekend helping me reclad the northern wall of the cottage, and that we worked side by side for 2 days without needing to talk much, and that the wall is straight and tight and will outlast both of us. I live at Murramarang full-time now. The cottage is better than it was when I arrived. I've been working on it steadily, the way I work on everything, checking each element in sequence and addressing what needs addressing. The creek still runs over the flat gray rocks. The spotted gums drop their bark in long ribbons every summer. The roof, which I have checked from every angle at every season, is sound. There is a photograph on the windowsill above the kitchen sink that Judith found among the things Margaret had stored here. It was taken in 1987, the year after we married. We are standing on a beach somewhere, Margaret laughing at something I've long forgotten, and I am looking at her with the expression of a man who knows he is exactly where he is supposed to be. I have stood in front of that photo on many mornings and understood that the expression on my face was correct. I was where I was supposed to be. I just didn't know yet how much it was going to cost her to keep me there. I have thought about what I would say to a younger man walking into the life I walked into, and what I keep coming back to is this. The people who love you hardest are sometimes the ones who look, from the outside, like they are barely tolerating you. Don't measure love only by its warmth. Sometimes love is a structure, and like any structure, you only understand how much load it was bearing after you see what was underneath it. I have also thought about what I would say to someone in Darren's position, young, brought into something before you understood its shape, too deep in it by the time you did. The longer you wait to tell the truth, the more of yourself you give to the lie. There is no version of that trade where you come out ahead. The debt compounds. And to Cassandra and Philip, if they ever stood still long enough to hear it, I would say only this. A family is not an asset class. You cannot restructure it to suit the figures. Every person in it carries a cost that doesn't show up on the balance sheet, and when you try to eliminate that cost, what you eliminate is the thing that made the whole structure worth building in the first place. Margaret understood that. She understood it so completely that she spent 37 years protecting it from her own children. The key is on a hook beside the front door now. The rust is still on it. I cleaned the ribbon. It's blue again, mostly, faded at the edges. I kept it because it is the last thing her hands tied, and because it opened the only door in my life that was ever truly built for me. Some evenings I sit on the veranda after the light drops and I can hear the sea through the she-oaks. And I think about how close it all came to ending differently. A tyre on the Prince's Highway at 80 kilometers an hour. A weekly pill organizer. A will. Written in the language of disposal. Any one of those things, handled differently. And I am not here to tell this to anyone. But I am here. She made sure of that. The last line of her final letter has stayed with me more than anything else, she wrote. She said, I know the silence looked like indifference. Raymond, it wasn't. It was the sound of someone who loved you standing between you and everything that wanted to reach you. I hope the quiet was worth it. I think you'll find it was. I fold that letter back into its envelope every evening, and I put it in the box on the shelf beside the window where the photograph is. And every morning I get up and I inspect the roof.